Hi, and welcome to the June edition of the Board Wrap-Up. The Ponca City School Board held their June board meeting. During the summer months, of course, the board meets, and we have Dr. Pennington with us to discuss some of the things going on with Ponca City Schools. Although it is summer, things are very, very busy right now. And one of the things that happened unusual for the Ponca City Schools is that normally things are quiet in the summer, but we are going to have to elect a new Board of Education member for one of our ward seats, and I know you wanted to address that with your constituents.
We had a unique situation happen at the board meeting the other night, and that is that the board had to take the action to declare Ward number 2 vacant, which is the seat held by Sam Downs. When anybody is elected to serve on the Board of Education, state law requires them to complete some professional development hours. They actually have 12 hours they have to complete within 15 months of their election. And then there's some additional hours they have to complete to run again. So it's not, I think that's probably unique to any other elected position in the state of Oklahoma. I'm not aware of any requirements for a member of the legislature or the governor or a city councilman that they have to go be trained. The reason for that is school board is unique. It's different than any other elected position in that, especially when it comes to issues like personnel, finance, those kinds of things that a layman, somebody who's not experienced with those things, may not be aware of exactly what the law is. Mr. Downs is unique in that he was a former school administrator, and so basically the things that went on in new school board member trainings were things that Mr. Downs knew. There are several ways to get those points. You can get them in a weekend workshop, or you can take classes, for lack of a better term, throughout the year. You have to take those. You have to have certain points. And as we approach the end of this year, Mr. Downs had not yet not received points for school finance or activity funds. He registered to take a webinar the last week of May, and Mr. Downs logged on, but for some reason the system that the School Board Association, which is the ones that offered the webinar, the way they kept track of points, his participation was not registered with them. We found that out on Monday, the first Monday of June, contacted the State School Board Association to see if there was any way to verify Mr. Downs' participation. They said there was not. Other than there's actually a survey that is taken at the end of the webinar, and that was not, they did not register with them. And then I called the State Department of Education to see if there was an appeal process. I mean, we have a gentleman who's been a superintendent before. He knows activity funds and school finance, and they said they had to have a way to verify. They couldn't verify the participation. And so they were not going to grant him any points. The way the state law reads is that the school board may declare the seat vacant. It's an interesting part of school law in that the state board can't make you declare the seat vacant, but if you don't declare the seat vacant, then either an individual citizen or the district attorney, and I don't remember that legal term, there's an action they can file that would require the board to do that, or you receive a deficiency on your state accreditation report. So while the law says may, there's not an automatic thing, which I think is kind of silly. I mean, to me, I don't know why they make the local board do that, but that's the way the law works. But so that's what happened, and so the board took that action in our May meeting, or our June meeting. And so now, because of that, we have a vacancy in Ward 2, which basically, this is in general, The northern boundary of that district is Prospect Avenue. The western boundary is the railroad tracks. The eastern boundary is Pecan. And then the southern boundary from the railroad tracks to Fifth Avenue runs along Roosevelt Street, and then it drops down, and Overbrook is that southern boundary. So that kind of gives you an idea. It's basically the old Washington attendance zone, and then a significant part of the Trout attendance zone. And so right now the board is taking applications. If anybody who's watching this says, hey, I live in that area, I might want to serve on the Board of Education, they can contact Mary Ladd. Mary Ladd will send them an application packet. There's a series of questions that the board would like the individual to respond to, a letter of interest. And then in July, we will have a special board meeting where candidates will be interviewed, and then the board will vote to select someone to serve in Mr. Downs' spot until an election is held in February. Under the old rules, when a seat became vacant, the school board appointed a replacement. That person served out the remainder of the term. About 10 years or so ago, depending on how much time in your term's left, if you have less than 2 years left, I think it may be less than 2 years, I believe, that you actually fill out the rest of the term. But if more than 2 years are left, then if the individual who's appointed decides to seek election of that post, they can file in December, and people could challenge that. So it's a little different in that you're not going to be appointed for the full term, and so I'm sure we may have some people who are interested in maybe sitting on the board until they're not interested in re-election. They just want to serve the community and help out until an election can be held. There may be some people interested in serving out for the next 3 years. So really, I guess almost 4, because Mr. Downs had just completed his first year in office. He'd been in office 15 months. So 15 months of a 60-month term. So that gives you an idea of the time frame we're working at. So we will have 2 board seats that are up for re-election in February, and so it be interesting to see what happens. We've had a lot of interest, and we'll see. Obviously, there's a difference between making a phone call and requesting a packet, and filling out the information and sending that in.
Who's the other board seat that's going to be up for election?
Judy Troop's seat will be up for election in February.
I got a question, and I want to put this as delicately as possible, because obviously people are free to vote for whoever they wish in an election, but Ponca City has a 5-seat school board, and I think sometimes people don't realize how much of an investment it is when a school board member goes on and goes through the training and the time that is necessary to be a good school board member. And in Ponca City, we have had 2 recent elections where a well-established board member who's gone through that process has been voted off, and now we have another scenario where someone who took the place of one of those board members is going to now be off the board. How frustrating is it to yourself and the current school board to have these scenarios present themselves, because it looks like it's always a training process instead of maybe a process where you have 5 people that you would like to work in unison?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, obviously, in our democratic system, we have elections, and the voters get to make those decisions. I think that obviously you would like to have higher turnout. One thing that's of a concern in an election like a school board race is that turnout's generally low. It's almost like a primary when you think about, next week, the 26th of June, we have primary elections, and we know that whether it's a Senate, House seat, whether it's a primary for the governor, we know that in primary elections, voter turnout is very small, and so you always wonder about whether or not whether a small turnout, what does that election really mean? What I've learned over time, I'm getting to that point now where I don't want to sound like, I can remember people telling me that when I was younger that, their experiences, I always thought those were old people stories. But what I've come to realize over time is that every election is different. Who would have dreamed that after the presidential election of 2008 that 2010 we'd have such a complete change in the national mood. So elections, elections mean something on the day of the election. After that, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of carryover of what it means as far as, is this really the will of the people, or is this a mandate or whatever. I would have been in that camp that said President Obama had a mandate, but that's definitely not the case now, and it wasn't the case in 2010. So I think we have to weigh that. Obviously, school board, it's an interesting job. And it's one that's really changed over time. At one time, the local school board really had a lot of authority. The board set policies. They hired administrators to carry those policies out. And the policies of a school district may not resemble the policies of a district next door to them. But over time, the state and federal government have taken more control of what local boards do. If you look at our policy book now, we have very few policies that are unique to Ponca City. Our policy book looks almost exactly like the policy book of Blackwell or Stillwater or Edmond or Jinx or Tulsa. And the reason for that is our policies are in place because of state law. State law tells us you will develop a policy, and that policy will contain these things. So that's one thing that's made it very unique. We live in a state where we have a minimum state salary schedule, so that we have to pay our teachers a certain amount of money. We pay better than that, but when you figure that the salaries of teachers is somewhere between 80 and 85% of your budget, you've really taken, there's really not any financial decisions really left to make. By the time you put support employees in there, and then you put in just the you got to pay an electric bill, you got to pay your gas bill, you got to pay for gasoline for buses. By the time all that's done, the reality is the board may have influence, a direct influence on maybe 5% of your budget. And so the reality is that the policies that are in place and the financial commitments that are made, a board has very little discretionary control. Now, a board member can take a lot of heat, which is very frustrating because you're getting criticized for decisions you make when the reality is the decision was made in either Oklahoma City or made in Washington, D.C. Obviously, there can be local things that boil up. Athletic teams are something that people have a lot of interest in. We live in a world today that always wants to fire the coach. But even take that scenario. The Board of Education, by state, but the way the policies of the board and the way state law are written, the board only acts upon superintendent recommendations. So if you have a board member who wants to fire a teacher or fire a coach, they on their own can't do that. They can't legally make a recommendation to the rest of the board to terminate somebody. Only I can make those recommendations. And so even that can be frustrating for people. The really authority that the board has is to hire and fire a superintendent. And then after that, they need to make sure that that superintendent is carrying out the policies and the wishes of the board. But to get to personnel, to get to money, to get to those things, their real authority comes in who that superintendent is. So it's an interesting spot to be in. I think the best thing that boards do is they provide me guidance on what direction we should head as a district. What is our vision? How do we want to function? And then they also serve a great sounding board as to what the public's thinking. We need to do another bond issue. We're going to have another bond election. Well, what should be on that bond issue? Should it just be classrooms and technology and buses? Should it be classroom, technology, buses, and a performing arts center? Should it be Maybe the community thinks we need a new elementary school. I mean, that's where the board really comes into play in helping sharpen the focus of what direction we're going to head. But the major thing they do is they hire a professional to operate the school district on a day-to-day basis. It's important that the board work together. I don't think it's ever a good thing for a community or a school district to have a board that has factions. And in our particular case, our board members need to be people who are committed to attending additional meetings. You know, we operate on a committee basis where we have a finance committee, a property committee, and a curriculum committee. Only 2 board members can serve on those committees. Otherwise, if you had 3 board members, that would be a board meeting. So we have 2 committee members, and those members have the responsibility, as we talk about finance and we look at the district finances, to not only advise the district administration, but also to be a sounding board for the rest of the board. So the rest of the board knows that when that finance committee has said, we've looked at the financial report, we believe everything's in order, that the other board members trust that person. And one of the things we suffered in the last year was because Mr. Downs had taken a position in another school district serving as an interim principal, he wasn't able to participate in our committee process. So, you know, we hope that whoever this next board member is will be able to participate, and that anybody that runs for the board in the future understands that for us to function, we need them to be able to make another hour meeting once a month. So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah. You wanted to address some budget concerns also with our citizens before we end our show.
You know, one of the things we did the other night is we do this every year in June. We have a meeting where we propose the budget for the next year. And again, as I mentioned before, so much of what we do is mandated by law. You know, we have to pay teachers a certain amount of money. We have to have so many teachers per student, even though we've abandoned the 10-17 class size requirements, we still, if at all possible, try to abide by those. Our class sizes have been higher in recent years. Some of it's because of the budget cuts we've taken. Some of it has to do with facility space. But for the last several weeks, we've heard about the legislature and the fact that they passed a standstill budget. And there seems to be a lot of pride, or at least it seems to get a lot of attention, that we've held education harmless, we've protected public schools. And obviously we appreciate that. I mean, obviously the legislature always has they could always cut us more, whether there needed to be a cut or not. You know, so you always had to be cautious in what you say. But when I had a chance to look at the state budget, I realized that the legislature had done something that I have never seen them do before. And we know in the past several years we've talked about school funding, which is very hard to understand. But there are some monies that are dedicated, revenues that the state of Oklahoma collects, that are dedicated to public schools. They cannot be spent on anything else. And then we have the general fund money of the state of Oklahoma. And that's the taxes that you and I pay that are not dedicated to anything else. And that's the money that we argue over. That's the money that when somebody, you know, the transportation department wants $50 million to build roads, or the prison system wants $50 million to improve prisons or hire more guards. The school district wants $200 million more and we want to give teachers a pay raise, or we want to start new programs. Typically what happens is when the legislature is allocating that money, and we all do this. I mean, I do this in my school budget. The programs that got the most money the year before get the most money the next year. Common education generally gets, you'll hear we get 35% of the state budget, you'll hear we get 51% of the state budget. Most of the money in the state of Oklahoma goes to education, and most of those dollars go to K-12 schools. And that state general fund allocation to state aid, which is the money that goes to support the direct operation of schools, generally from year to year doesn't change unless you have a budget shortfall. So if you had $1 million in the general fund state aid appropriation in 2000, when you do the 2001 budget, you start with that $1 million appropriation and you build from there. This last session, we had we kept seeing that the state of Oklahoma was collecting more money than it collected the year before. And for some of us, it's been hard to understand if our state budget state revenue has increased by several $1 million. Why aren't schools getting more money? Well, what we were told was, well, here's one thing we want to do is we want to rebuild the rainy day fund. We want to refill our savings account before we spend money in other areas. Well, I don't know that I would agree with that, but I understand that. The other thing that happened is when the recession hit the hardest, the legislature did not pay some of the tax credits they'd granted to business. And they told the business community that, we're not going to give you your money, but we're going to pay you back, and we're going to pay you back with interest. So they paid back the business community for tax credits, tax exemptions, those kinds of things, before they repaid the money to the school children in the state of Oklahoma. Don't know that I agree with that, but if you tell me that's what you've got to do, then I understand that. But this is what I don't understand. The state of Oklahoma, the legislative leadership, out of the amount of state aid general fund revenue we received in 2011-12 school year, they subtracted $73 million from that pot of money. And they refilled that with revenues that are dedicated to schools. Bottom line is they had to make an effort, a purposeful decision to not add $73 million to the state funding formula this year. So they did. So it's not a matter of the money, the argument that the money wasn't there, that doesn't hold water. What they did is they took $71 million of 1017 money, which is money that is going to school districts in this state anyway. They can't spend it on anything else. They took $73 million out of the general fund state aid formula, and they replenished that with 1017 money. There was some money in a technology fund and a minerals fund that made up the other $2 million. So the state legislature, the leadership of this state, made a purposeful decision to take $73 million out of state money for schools and spend it in other areas. Now, the reason we didn't take a cut is because they had these other revenues that were dedicated for schools anyway. That's not the purpose of those revenues. Those revenues were intended to supplement the general fund dollars of the state of Oklahoma to schools. They were never intended to supplant. That's happened off and on over the years, where maybe the state revenue that we collect, maybe we'll lose $5 million, or maybe we'll lose $10 million. But the result of that is they take other funds, replenish that back, and we end up with more money than we started off with. And so generally, because our revenue has increased, we don't say anything about that. But from my perspective, this is really wrong. I mean, especially the 1017 money. For those of our viewers who maybe weren't in Oklahoma in 1990, just to refresh, we had a statewide movement to increase funding for schools. And the legislature passed legislation which increased the income tax, the corporate income tax, and the sales tax, and said that this money is designated to the schools of the state of Oklahoma. And then they created a lockbox, so that money went into a special fund so the legislature couldn't use it for any other purpose. And then a group of citizens circulated a petition, said we don't like 1017 and we want to have a recall vote. which they did, and which that measure was defeated. So the citizens of the state voted this tax upon themselves to improve our schools. And to improve, at that time we were 48th in the nation in what we spend on education. It was a purposeful decision by the people of the state of Oklahoma to spend more on our schools. Well, today we're 49th in what we spend on schools. And we're 49th because the legislature made the decision to take that money away out of the general appropriation for schools and spend it on other places. If that $71 million were in place, in our case, in our district, that'd be $2 million more than Ponca City schools would have to hire back some of the teachers that we lost in the recession, to refund some programs that are starving to death right now. But we made the decision not to do that. And again, I'm sure the people in the legislature and the governor's office that made that decision believe they made that decision for good purposes. But I really think that they really violated the trust of the people of the state.
But it will affect teachers, it will affect programs
You
in
bet.
Ponca City.
You bet. What's happened now is for the last 3 years we've had federal money to use. We had stimulus money, then we had jobs money, and that's how we've gotten through this recession without having to do layoffs or to lay off any staff. We've got basically one more year of carryover money left. So we know we're going to get through this year basically with the same program intact we have now. But it didn't have to be that way. We could have started rebuilding our economic base. Our teachers haven't had a pay raise, a legitimate pay raise. We get a step increase, but a real pay raise in 4 years. Eventually that will cause us to lose people. Not to other districts in Oklahoma, because nobody else in Oklahoma is giving pay raises either. But it will cause our people to lose the profession, leave the profession, or it will cause them to go out of state. And again, what amazes me is we can have people calling for a tax cut in this state, and then they tell us they're going to fund core services. Well, you're not funding core services. If funding core services means that you just keep the spending where it is, well, that's fine. But our electric bill goes up, our gas bill goes up, the price of gasoline goes up, and the people who work for us, their gas bills go up, their electric bills go up, their clothing bills go up. None of us can function very well if we don't somewhere in the process receive money to fund salary increases, and that has an effect upon our people live here, and so when our teachers get a $1,000 raise, they're going to spend most of that money in Oklahoma, and most of them are going to spend it in Ponca City. So again, we're in this. I understand that people want to have smaller government. I understand that people want to pay less taxes. But there is a price to pay for that. And the greatest price is paid for by our children. If we really believe that our children are our future, and we really believe that the key to the future is education, then we've got to figure out a way to really fund the schools in the state of Oklahoma. And we keep trotting out the same old ideas. We need to do away with school districts. Well, we're funded on a per student basis. We're not funded on the number of school districts we have. The bottom line is, when you look at what we spend on kids in this state, we spend less than almost anybody else in America. I think we have to look at that.
49th, wow.
Yeah.
Dr. Pennington, thanks for your time. That's this month's edition of the Board Wrap-Up.